She agreed to marry him for the homestead. He agreed to let her leave in spring. The terms were discussed at the kitchen table of the land office in Beaufort, Dakota Territory, on a Wednesday afternoon in October, with a pot of cold coffee and 2 tin cups between them, and the homestead filing papers spread out like a treaty between 2 nations that did not yet trust each other. The terms were these. Hollis Crane needed a wife to prove up on his claim. Ada Sinclair needed a place to spend the winter that was not the street. The marriage would be legal. The arrangement would be practical. In spring, when the claim was proved and the ground thawed and the roads opened, Ada would leave. Hollis would not stop her. Neither of them would owe the other anything, except the 6 months of shared labor and shared shelter that the winter required. "You understand the terms," Hollis said. He was not asking. He was confirming, the way a man confirms the specifications of a contract before signing, because Hollis Crane was a man who believed deeply in contracts, the way other men believed in God, with reverence and absolute faith in the binding nature of clearly stated obligations.
"I understand the terms," Ada said.
"I marry you. I live on the claim. I help with the work. In spring, I leave. In the spring, you leave. And you do not come after me. I do not come after you. I do not write to you. I do not expect you to write to me. In spring, the arrangement ends." Agreed. They shook hands. They shook hands across the table in the land office, the way 2 business partners shake hands, firmly and briefly, with eye contact that acknowledged the seriousness of the agreement and the mutual understanding that the agreement was temporary and that the temporariness was not a flaw, but the point. Hollis Crane was 35. He had come to Dakota Territory from Pennsylvania 2 years earlier, with $300 and the intention of proving up on a quarter section of grassland 12 miles north of Beaufort. The homestead law required 5 years of continuous residence and improvement, and Hollis had completed 2 years, building a Soddy that was small but tight, breaking 30 acres of prairie with a plow and a team of oxen, and establishing himself as a man who worked from dawn until dark, without complaint and without company. Because company required conversation, and conversation required a willingness to reveal something about oneself, and Hollis Crane did not reveal things about himself. He was private, the way the prairie was flat, completely, in all directions, without variation or apology. He needed a wife because the land office had informed him, through a clerk who enjoyed delivering bad news, that a married homesteader's claim was stronger than a single man's claim, and that there were parties interested in contesting his quarter section, and that a wife on the claim would make the contesting considerably more difficult. The need was legal, not personal. The wife was a document, not a companion. The marriage was a filing, not a feeling. These were the categories in which Hollis Crane organized the world, and the categories had served him well for 35 years, and he saw no reason to question them now. Ada Sinclair was 29. She had arrived in Beaufort 3 days before the meeting at the land office, on a freight wagon from Yankton, with a carpet bag and $4, and the particular expression of a woman who has exhausted every option and who is now operating in the territory beyond options. The territory where a person does whatever is next, because whatever is next is the only thing left. She had been a milliner's assistant in Yankton for 2 years, until the milliner died and the shop closed. She had been a boarding house cook until the boarding house burned. She had been a school teacher's aide until the school term ended and was not renewed. Each job had been a rung on a ladder, and each rung had broken, and the breaking had been cumulative, and now she was standing on the ground with no ladder and no rungs and $4, which was enough for 2 weeks of meals and no roof. She had heard about Hollis Crane from the land office clerk. The same clerk who enjoyed delivering bad news also enjoyed arranging other people's lives, and the hearing had been simple. There was a man who needed a wife on paper, and there was a woman who needed a roof in winter, and the 2 needs were complementary, the way a lock and a key are complementary in function, not because they belong together, but because they fit. The wedding was performed by a justice of the peace on Thursday. There were no guests, there were no flowers, there was no music, The justice read the words, and Hollis said, "I do," and Ada said, "I do," and the words were true in the legal sense, and hollow in every other sense. The way a cup is true when it is empty. It is still a cup. It can still hold something, but at the moment of the saying it held nothing but the shape of what a cup is supposed to contain. They rode to the homestead in Hollis's wagon. The ride was 12 miles and took 3 hours, and during those 3 hours they spoke 11 words, which Ada counted, because counting was something to do, and because the counting told her things about Hollis Crane that conversation would not have revealed, that he was comfortable with silence, that he did not fill empty space with noise, that his hands on the reins were steady and sure, and that his profile against the flat Dakota sky was the profile of a man who had decided long ago what he was, and was not interested in revision. The Soddy was small. It was one room, 12 feet by 14, with a packed earth floor and walls of cut sod 3 feet thick that kept the cold out and the warmth in, with the efficiency of a cave and the charm of a cave, which was none. There was a stove, a table, 2 chairs, a bed, and a shelf, with 3 books, and a tin of coffee, and a box of salt. The bed was narrow. "I will sleep on the floor," Hollis said. "You will have the bed. The floor is dirt. I have a bedroll. I have slept on worse." "For 6 months?" "For 6 months." Ada looked at the Soddy. She looked at the bed and the floor and the stove and the 3 books on the shelf and the 2 chairs at the table, and she understood that this was what 6 months of her life would look like. 12 feet by 14, dirt floor, sod walls, a man who slept on the ground and spoke 11 words in 3 hours, and who had married her the way he might have purchased a tool, for a specific purpose, with the intention of returning it when the purpose was served. November came and the cold came with it. The cold in Dakota Territory was not the cold of cities or the cold of river valleys. It was the cold of open grassland under open sky, the cold that comes from having nothing between a person and the wind for 100 miles in any direction, the cold that finds its way into a house through cracks that cannot be seen and seams that cannot be sealed, and that settles into a person's bones, the way damp settles into wood. Ada had never experienced cold like this. She had lived in towns her whole life, in buildings with proper walls and glass windows, and the Soddy's cold was a different animal, a living thing that prowled along the floor at night and pressed against the walls and found every gap and every weakness. She stuffed the gaps. She took rags and old newspaper and tallow, and she found every crack where the wind came through, and she sealed it shut. And the sealing was long hours of patient work on her hands and knees in the cold, pushing material into crevices that the cold had found and she had not. And the work was the first thing she did on the homestead that was not part of the agreement. The agreement was labor. She would cook and clean and help with the stock and the garden and the 100 daily tasks of a claim. The gap sealing was not labor, it was care. And the care was directed not at the Soddy, but at the man who slept on the floor of it. Because a man sleeping on a dirt floor in November in Dakota Territory should not also have to sleep in a draft, and the should not was Marin's, Ada's, first uncontracted feeling about Hollis Crane. Hollis noticed the sealed gaps. He noticed them the way he noticed changes on the land, by the absence of the wind where the wind had been, by the welcome silence of the draft, by the warmth that held steady through the night instead of bleeding away by midnight. He did not comment on it. He did not thank her. He built a second shelf. He built it because Ada had 3 dresses and nowhere to put them except the carpet bag. And the carpet bag on the floor was a problem that a shelf would solve. And the building of the shelf was not part of the agreement either. The shelf was care, directed at a woman who had stuffed the cracks to keep him warm. And the care was his first uncontracted feeling about Ada Sinclair. December came and the snow came, and the world outside the Soddy became a white plain that extended in every direction without feature or boundary, a landscape that erased the difference between earth and sky and left only the Soddy, small and square and warm, at the center of everything. Inside the Soddy, the 12 by 14 room became a world, and the world contained 2 people who had agreed to share it for 6 months, and who were discovering, in the sharing, that the categories Hollis had established, legal, not personal, practical, not emotional, temporary, not permanent, were not holding. They were not holding because Ada read his 3 books, one about agriculture, one about the history of Rome, and one about the construction of bridges. And she asked him questions about the bridges, and the questions were intelligent and specific, and led to conversations that lasted longer than 11 words. Conversations that filled the evenings when the work was done, and the stove was warm, and the wind was outside, and they were inside, and the being inside together was changing the shape of the arrangement, the way water changes the shape of stone, slowly, without force, by the persistent fact of its presence. They were not holding because Hollis, who had never cooked anything more complex than bacon and coffee, watched Ada make bread and stew and pie from the limited supplies in the Soddy, and the watching was the watching of a man who is seeing a skill he does not possess, exercised with grace and economy, and the grace was beautiful to him in the way that a well-set horseshoe was beautiful, or a straight furrow was beautiful, the beauty of competence, of a thing done right. They were not holding because Ada, who had never lived with a man, discovered that Hollis Crane's silence was not emptiness, but fullness. The fullness of a man who said what he meant and meant what he said, and who did not require noise to feel present. And the fullness was restful in a way that Ada had not expected, because her life had been noise, the noise of towns and shops and boarding houses and schools. And the silence of the Soddy, with Hollis, was the first silence she had experienced that felt like peace rather than absence. January came. February. March. The snow began to thin. The light began to change. Longer days, warmer afternoons. The first suggestion of spring in the color of the sky, and the sound of water running beneath the ice in the creek. Spring was coming. Spring was the end of the agreement. Spring was when Ada would leave and Hollis would not come after her, and neither would owe the other anything. Ada was mending Hollis's shirt at the table on an evening in late March when she said, without looking up from the needle, "Spring is in 3 weeks. I know. The terms say I leave in spring. The terms say you leave in spring. Do you want me to leave?" Hollis was quiet. The quiet lasted longer than his usual quiets, which were the quiets of a man thinking before speaking. This quiet was the quiet of a man deciding whether to speak at all, because speaking would change things, and not speaking would preserve things, and the preserving was safer, but the changing was truer. "No," he said. "I do not want you to leave." Then change the terms. The terms were clear. The terms were made by 2 people who did not know each other. Those people are not the people sitting at this table. The people sitting at this table have sealed cracks and built shelves and read books about bridges and made bread from nothing and slept in the same room for 6 months. And the sleeping has been the most honest thing either of us has done, because we were both alone before we were in this room, and we are not alone anymore, and the not alone is better. Hollis looked at Ada across the table, across the mending, across the 6 months that had passed between the handshake in the land office and this moment, and he understood that the categories he had built, legal, practical, temporary, had been replaced by something that did not fit in categories. He understood it the way he understood the land, not all at once, but by accumulation, by the daily fact of her presence, by the sealed gaps in the shelf and the bread and the questions about bridges, by the patient, persistent truth that a person who lives with another person for 6 months in a 12 by 14 room either becomes a stranger or becomes essential, and Ada Sinclair had become essential. "Stay," he said. "Change the terms first. The terms are changed. Stay. Not for the claim, not for the winter. Stay because I built you a shelf, and you sealed my walls, and neither of us did those things because of a contract." Ada set down the mending. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who had agreed to a temporary arrangement and had found, inside the arrangement, the permanent thing she had not known she was looking for. Not a ladder with rungs that broke, but a floor, solid and level, that held. "I will stay," she said, "but I want a second shelf." Hollis almost smiled. It was not quite a smile. It was the thing that happens to the face of a man who has not smiled in a long time, and whose face has forgotten how, but is beginning to remember. He nodded. I will build you a second shelf, he said. And he did. He built it the very next morning, before the sun was even fully up, out of cottonwood planks that he had been saving for a gate. The gate could wait. The shelf could not. The shelf was not part of any agreement. The shelf was the thing that came after agreements. The thing that has no terms and no end date and no handshake. The thing that is built because a man wants to build it for a woman who is staying, not because she has to, but because she has chosen to, and the choosing is the only contract that matters.